Hey Kings, and welcome back to the Augustus Maximus channel, and it's been a while, but we're back playing as Italy and Napoleon Total War using the Darth mod, the latest version obviously. Now, it's been a while and I skipped over a few happenings, a few events, mostly just taking over Naples, which is basically the biggest event, but I only auto-resolved the battle because, as it happens, Naples, while it did have a big army, it was mostly trash. And I'm not really going to fight against a whole bunch of militia. It's an interesting fact. I'm not entirely sure if this is something unique to Naples, but maybe because the region isn't as rich, or maybe because they just don't get as many cheats. But they didn't really have that great of an army compared to a majority of the other one province AIs. But what this means is that now, except for Sicily and well, a few of the Austrian provinces up north, we own at least a majority of Italy, or the Italian peninsula, or what constitutes modern Italy. And so this episode we are going to be going on the offensive against Austria, because Austria is an interesting nation, Napoleon Total War, and an Empire Total War to a certain degree, but mostly Napoleon, in that it's a European major power. It's a European major power, but it's extremely weak throughout the entire campaign. But they do have these power spikes where they lash out against France. And it's extremely interesting because they do initially start at war, well, basically around turn 2, they start the war against the Ottoman Empire, and they're at war with the French Empire right off the bat. Which you'd think would be actually kind of easy to handle, because the Russians are also at war with the Ottomans fairly early on, so you'd think that they'd maybe capture Bosnia and leave the rest to Russia. However, the Ottomans usually play defensively, and what this means is that a majority of the fighting is around Austria is going to be happening with the Ottomans and the French at the same time, which means a two-front war, and that never really works out all that well for the German-speaking nations, now does it? So the Austrians in this campaign were actually putting up a decent fight, which is quite interesting, because in Darth mod I was expecting the Austrians to do badly, as they always do in Napoleon Total War and in my other campaigns, which I've played, you know, single player and stuff. Using Darth mod, the Austrians always crumble, and they're even crumbling in this campaign to a certain degree, but they're actually putting up a decent fight, which is actually quite interesting. And I think we actually played a pretty major role in that, because some of the nations in the Italian peninsula, which constitutes essentially the southern front, or the southwestern front for the Austrians, some of them are actually allied to Austria now through subterfuge and bribing all the major nations and bribing the minor nations and then just attacking them. We managed to break a variety of those alliances, well, mostly just the Papal States and Naples, respectively. But I think it's time to go to war with Austria by using the French and just joining the war, because when you join the war using an already existing enemy in Napoleon Total War, none of the other allies of the nation that you're attacking actually join all that often. You're not declaring a war directly, you're just joining a war, which means that none of their allies come in, which means that we're only going to be at war with Austria and nobody really else. Which is quite interesting, because what this means is that we won't have to worry about the Russians as early as we normally would have to worry about them, because they are somewhat close. It doesn't seem like they're all that close because they're, well, way in the east, but the Russians actually start off with a couple of armies hovering around the Austrian capital. So this means that we can very early on and very easily take care of the Austrians right here, where they're worrying about the Russians. And because the Austrians are so battered after fighting the French for so long, well, it's been only a couple of years, but for so long, let's say, and also they are tied down south where they have to fight against the Ottomans, destroying the Austrians here is going to be, well, it's going to be quite easy. For one, it's going to be beneficial because we're going to be creating essentially just Italy. We're going to be trying to essentially just control of all of Italy, which includes Tyrol, Venice, and because we're going for the Western Roman Empire, we also have to capture Croatia and then Vienna. And for that to happen, we are going to have to fight against the Austrians. Now, as you just saw, we did actually try to auto-resolve that. However, Napoleon Total War does sort of overrate artillery, especially because, you know, it's in the hands of an AI. That's why it's overrated. And what's more curious is that the army that we are up against right now actually went against, I believe, one French army and then had to siege down Tyrol itself. And now we're fighting against it, so it's actually quite battered, and yet in the auto-resolve we still lost because they have quite a lot of artillery. And to actually give props to either the Napoleon Total War AI or Darth mod, the AI in this battle actually does try to position itself very, very carefully, as you can see from not only the minimap but also just the game field itself. They do try to make the artillery sort of the centerpiece of their defense. Which is probably the best bet they actually have at defending here and actually winning here, because their artillery is something that I completely lack in my army. I have no artillery, only have infantry and some light cavalry, and my infantry is not the best yet. We'll get some really good infantry way down the line because of the unique units that Italy gets. We'll get some good infantry down the line, but at the moment, obviously, we are still sort of a minor power. We have to rely on just basic line infantry, and it's not the best. And we also don't have the best upgrades and everything like that, so we aren't exactly packing a lot of heat here, whereas the enemy has some decent line infantry and, more importantly, the artillery. However, the AI never actually plays with the artillery all that magnificently. They don't necessarily make the best use of it. They don't tend to put it on high grounds or anything like that. They do try to position quite nicely around the artillery, even in vanilla Napoleon Total War. However, in the case of Napoleon Total War in general and Empire Total War, artillery and just Total War in general, just strategy in general, when you use artillery you do give up quite a bit of maneuverability, and this sort of debuff or whatever nerf to their army does allow me to spread around their troops quite a bit and sort of outmaneuver them, because, well, artillery is packs quite a punch when it comes to ranged combat, obviously, and does do a lot of damage. If you spread your lines thin and try to outmaneuver them and flank around them, everything like that, you do gain quite a lot of, quite a big, well, just bonus to your overall performance, because you aren't restricted to defending a very cumbersome but effective and expensive artillery pieces, but they're obviously slow. You can't maneuver them around so quickly if you're not using horse artillery. And horse artillery, while it's great when it comes to maneuverability, you still have to deploy it, you still have to defend it, and it's not great at defending itself in close range. Obviously, it's more of a tactical and strategic long range device more than anything, which is a strange way to describe artillery, because obviously everyone knows what that is, but it does allow me to play more of a mobile game, a mobile battle, while they are restricted to that one position that they do have to defend, because giving up artillery, even historically, it's like, that's just a terrible idea. And a lot of times, especially in the Napoleonic period, but even during the 18th century in general and the 19th century in general, capturing the opponent's artillery usually meant that you just won the battle. That was the biggest goal of the entire battle, because those are expensive, and it's reflected quite accurately in game, because it takes a long time to build them. They're relatively expensive, the upkeep is quite a bit, and they do pose a considerable threat. So it's actually modeled quite well in Napoleon Total War, and if this was an online battle, it would actually be quite a serious match, because we do have two very different strategies at play and two army builds at play, whereas I'm playing more of the maneuver game, and the opponent's playing more of the stand your ground and shell them from afar game, which is sort of a more World War I approach, or just the defensive approach in general, if you do actually have the artillery advantage. However, obviously this is an AI we're talking about, and even though the Napoleon Total War vanilla AI is actually quite decent, and Darth mod obviously makes it a tiny bit better, and we obviously have some buffs to the enemy AI on the battlefield because we're playing on hard battles. It's still obviously not not quite as enticing as an online battle would be. So while for a bit it does actually seem kind of interesting, once you start to surround the enemy army and outmaneuver them, because you have well, an advantage when it comes to maneuverability and infantry. Whereas they do have that long range, since once you close in on that long range, the AI never really adapts too well. They sort of stick to their guns, stick to their original tactic, and don't evolve the strategy at all, which is something that you usually see in Total War games. The AI doesn't really evolve their strategy on the go. They don't necessarily react in the most comprehensible manner when it comes to threats from various directions. For example, being completely encircled here, well, they do launch a few cavalry charges to try and disrupt my lines. It's not necessarily a very good long-term solution to the issue that they're having, which is being completely encircled. And while the my units that are directly in front of the artillery are taking a heavy beating, and I think some of them actually do rout. On the flanks, we're just completely secure, we're smashing them, we are countering their cavalry charges either with square formations or our own cavalry, and overall, initially the AI had some good, the Austrians here had some good tactics planned out, I think, or just mapped out, or just designed. I don't know how the process when it comes to Napoleon Total War and developing its battle AI went. Ultimately, because it didn't adapt, it obviously failed, and so that's the battle for Tyrol. And I'm gonna skip forward a little bit to the Battle of Venice, which is a very similar situation in a sense, because we have obviously a pure infantry army with 4 battalions, or 4 battalions of cavalry. And other than that, it's a line infantry and a general's unit, obviously. Whereas the opponent does have less artillery this time, and the army is less battered. However, it's a very similar situation in that we are obviously attacking a city, and the enemy is defending, and we do have an army that is a little bit more maneuverable than theirs, because they do have that artillery. However, in this battle, we do see the enemy actually, well, try to develop their tactics a little bit, and they do also have a fair few reinforcements. And so, while the original tactic that I had in mind was something similar, just outmaneuver them, and hopefully try to surround them if they do try to defend the city, which actually might be their best bet, just trying to defend within the streets of the city itself, because while we do have a numerical advantage, because we don't have any artillery or any mortars or howitzers or anything like that, we won't be able to actually hit them in their back lines or try to disrupt their lines in any meaningful way. The only option would be to try to fight them in the streets one-on-one. And if this was an online battle, I do presume that maybe the play would have gone for something like this, actually try to sort of Stalingrad me, where they basically fight me tooth and nail for every house and every street. And that would have been a very interesting battle, but that's not actually quite what happened. This turned out to be a very standard line battle, very standard Napoleonic era battle, which is quite a disappointment, because Napoleon Total War does have quite a few unique scenarios that you can battle, and especially if you're doing a co-op campaign, if you're playing an online battle or something like that, you can really mix it up quite a bit because of the, not necessarily because of the unit variety, or the extreme differences between individual nations compared to something like obviously Warhammer Total War, or even Shogun to follow the Samurai, because of the different technological approaches and different approaches to warfare in general. When it comes to Shogun to follow the Samurai, one side obviously has more of a melee approach initially, the other side very early on tries to go for the ranged approach. Very early on, the first sort of half of the campaign and Follow the Samurai is very interesting, especially if you're playing against a player, because you do have very different approaches to warfare in general. In the late game, it does obviously shift to just gunpowder, and turns into more of a Napoleonic thing all over again. However, in Napoleon Total War, what you have are very different scenarios based on the composition of armies. And especially depending on the nation you're playing. For example, the French have basically everything. That's great. However, a lot of it is expensive and you can't bring a lot of it with you in battle. So you won't be able to bring their best cavalry, best infantry, best artillery. So you have to have a very sort of unique approach to army composition, and this is where the sort of uniqueness of Napoleon Total War shines. For example, here we're playing as Italy, but pure infantry build, which means that we do have quite a high amount of maneuverability, as opposed to the standard Napoleon Total War build, which is just make use of the broken artillery mechanics because they have unlimited ammo. You can just shell your opponent to death and basically take 0 casualties. However, you're extremely restricted, and if you're playing in campaign, it means that you're essentially, if you're not fighting, those artillery pieces are doing nothing, and they're just basically taxing you quite a bit. So this means that I went with trying to maximize the potential of my nation, or the nation that we're playing, because we aren't in the best economic situation right now. We just got done conquering essentially Naples. Just got done conquering the 2 Sicilies, essentially. 2 Sicilies? I think it's Naples. Naples are the 2 Sicilies, because Sicily isn't owned by 2 Sicilies. Whatever. We just got done conquering the south part of Italy, and that's not necessarily the richest province. In fact, we might have actually wasted more cash gaining it than what we immediately got from it. And so we aren't in the best economic position. However, what this does mean is that we are able to justify a pure infantry build, which does have obviously the advantage of being pure, does have the advantage of being more mobile, whereas the Austrians, they do have more cash than we do, and they do bring a few artillery pieces here and there, and so they do have a more mixed build. However, we try to play to our strengths, and because the AI sometimes tries to adapt, but as you can see on screen, it's this has basically devolved into standard Napoleon Total War AI, just waving around the place. In fact, this resembles Empire Total War more than Napoleon Total War, which might have to do with it being actually a siege battle, and we are the attackers, so maybe the AI is trying to defend here, but they're also trying to maybe counterattack here, so maybe just like 2 initiatives are pulling the AI in 2 different directions. Another fact is that they obviously have a reinforcing army, so maybe they're trying to wait for that one. It's all kinds of messed up, but as you can see, this battle is, again, they got completely encircled, and it turned into, well, just a messier version of the previous battle. So that was a lot of fighting, and now we own both Tyrol and Venice in a very swift attack, very, well, mobile offensive throughout the southern front of the Austrian War, whatever you want to call it. We managed to capture 2 relatively rich cities. Venice especially is quite valuable. Tyrol not so much, but strategically the position is actually quite beneficial, because it's in the middle of the Alps. It's one of the few pathways that lead from Germany or Central Europe to Italy. The other one being Venice, obviously, which we also own. So whether the Austrians or just in general our opponents that might be located in that general direction, if they try to approach Italy or try to attack us, they will have to go through those 2 cities, which means that we actually can mount quite a reasonable defense there. Now, what comes next is going to have to be the conquest of Croatia and Vienna, which is going to be quite annoying. And after that, that means if we can capture Vienna and Croatia, that means that we have sufficiently conquered enough territory in the east to actually form the sort of easternmost borders of the Western Roman Empire, which is Croatia and well, as I suppose you could say that the western portion of Hungary, but again, I went over this in the last episode. We can't actually split Hungary down the middle, which is quite unfortunate, so we'll have to do with just Vienna and Croatia. this isn't quite EU4 or anything like that, so it's not quite possible to capture the provinces exactly, which is quite a shame, but at the same time, hey, what can you do? So you're gonna have to capture Croatia and Vienna, and that's basically going to be it when it comes to Austria. Now after that, I was thinking obviously we're gonna have to capture Sicily. After that, it's quite possible that we're going to have to go against France, because France is now going to go ballistic. Essentially, we've weakened Vienna, not Vienna, well, Vienna obviously, but Austria quite a bit, and they're also mounting quite a significant attack against the Prussians. Now, we do have open borders with the French. We're actually friendly, very friendly with the French. We're trading with them, so going against the French right away might be extremely terrible, not only for our reputation, but also for our economic position and for our strategic position. What we need to do is capture Croatia, Vienna, somehow pay off the Allies, or the coalition in general, somehow pay off the Austrians, try to give them enough money and technology for them to be actually willing to sign the peace treaty, even potentially, try to make them a little bit more powerful so they do resist the French in the future, at least a tiny bit longer. Try to be friendly with the Russians and the British and the Prussians and everyone in the coalition. Then try to do some subterfuge, maybe between the Ottomans and the French, to try to bring those two guys into war, which is unlikely because we don't actually need anything from the Ottomans, so it would be unlikely for us to do anything with the Ottomans. However, we do need the entirety of the Iberian Peninsula. Now, what I'm thinking here is that we might actually want to engage in subterfuge when it comes to dividing France and Spain. Break that alliance apart. Remain friendly with the French. However, annihilate Spain. Conquer the entirety of Spain, which means that we'll have basically absolute dominance over the Mediterranean, and maybe try and buy off a few regions from the French if they're willing to sell, and then move against the French. So it's going to be quite a ways, and then obviously move on to Britain and capture the entirety of Britain. So that's actually quite a task if you lay it out like this. There's actually quite a lot of things that we have to think about and we have to take into account and we have to plan towards, because it's not unfeasible that randomly, just completely out of the blue, the French just attack us, because that's France in Napoleon Total War. They just attack you randomly. This is the one issue that Prussia, for example, always has, whereas it's always in every single trailer and every single sort of promo material that you see about Napoleon Total War. See that Prussia is supposed to be the wild card. That could go either way, but big surprise, on turn 10 the French just attack you. Even if you're friendly with them, the French just attack you for some reason. So the French do have this tendency of just randomly attacking you because they just can, and they can completely steamroll you if you're not careful and not prepared. So we'll have to actually, do quite a lot of preparation here, and this the money that we are gonna capture from obviously capturing Vienna, all the Austrian territories, and all the trading nodes is going to come in quite handy when we actually go to move against first Spain, well, first Austria, then Spain, possibly Portugal, though I don't think so. Portugal might be on the chopping block when we actually go against Britain, because that's quite the alliance. So yeah, there's quite a lot of stuff we still have to do, and well, there's quite a lot of territory we have to capture, quite a lot of stuff we have to do, and quite a lot of battles that we still have to play out. So, well, anyway, Kings, thanks for watching, and see you next time.